Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to a place where the air is thick with the scent of spices, the murmur of foreign tongues fills narrow alleys, and something entirely new is brewing. You're there, standing on the docks of Istanbul, the mighty Ottoman capital. The year is roughly 1555, and ships from distant lands are unloading their treasures. Among the silks, gems, and exotic fruits, there's a peculiar, dark bean arriving. This isn't just cargo. It's a cultural revolution in waiting, a tiny seed poised to completely upend social norms and spark debates that will echo for centuries. Honestly, navigating the social minefield these little beans created? You probably won't survive this without accidentally committing a major faux pas or getting tangled in a spy network. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. While you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, picture it, you're a merchant, a scholar, or maybe just a curious bystander in 16th century Istanbul. News travels by word of mouth, rumors swirling like dust devils in the market square. And lately, there's a buzz about this new drink. It's dark, aromatic, and supposedly keeps you wide awake. Where did it come from? The story goes that it arrived from Yemen, carried by traders or perhaps pilgrims returning from Mecca. They brought these beans, these kawa beans, and with them, a new way to consume them. Initially, it wasn't like walking into your local Starbucks. There were no fancy machines, no 20-page menus. It was a simple, perhaps crude, preparation. The beans were roasted, ground, and then boiled with water. The result was thick, sometimes muddy, but undeniably potent. The first encounters with this brew were likely cautious. People were used to water, sherbet, or maybe fermented drinks, though alcohol was generally frowned upon, if not outright forbidden, for Muslims. This dark, bitter liquid was different. It didn't quench thirst in the same way, but it offered something else: alertness. A jolt. A sustained wakefulness that was completely novel. Think about your day-to-day life back then. Sunrise to sunset dictated your rhythm. Artificial light was expensive and limited. Staying up late wasn't really a thing unless you were doing something illicit or incredibly important. Suddenly, this drink offered the possibility of extending the productive day, of burning the midnight oil, if you could afford the oil. This effect was probably the first thing that caught people's attention, and perhaps their suspicion. Anything that altered your state of mind or body could be viewed with caution, especially in a society deeply rooted in religious doctrine. One mainstream historical fact is that coffee is widely believed to have arrived in Istanbul around the mid-16th century, specifically often cited as 1555, brought by two Syrian merchants. This arrival date is a cornerstone of coffee history in the region. But even this seemingly simple fact has layers. Historians still argue whether it was truly these specific merchants, or if coffee had been trickling in earlier through less documented channels. Was it traders? Sufi mystics using it for late-night prayers? The exact moment of its official arrival is a bit fuzzy around the edges, like the bottom of an unfiltered coffee cup. The initial reaction wasn't universal acclaim. Imagine being offered a cup of this strange, dark liquid. What does it taste like? Bitter, probably. Unlike anything you've ever had. Does it have an effect? Yes, a noticeable one. This stimulating property was both its appeal and its potential downfall in the eyes of some. Was it intoxicating? Was it harmful? Was it even permissible under Islamic law? These questions immediately arose. It wasn't just a new drink, it was a new experience that needed to be categorized and understood within the existing cultural and religious framework. A quirky or fringe tidbit about this early period is the initial use of coffee. While it's now synonymous with social spaces, some early accounts suggest it was first adopted by scholars and religious figures, particularly Sufi dervishes, who used it to stay awake during long hours of prayer and meditation. This gives it a slightly more spiritual, almost ascetic, origin story in the empire before it became a widespread social phenomenon. It wasn't just a pick-me-up. It was a tool for spiritual discipline. Who knew your morning latte had such potentially pious roots? Though I doubt your barista knows the proper incantations for divine focus. The cautious reception wasn't just about taste or effect, it was also about novelty. New things, especially things that gain popularity quickly, tend to make authorities nervous. Why are people suddenly gathering? What are they talking about with all this newfound energy? The simple act of sharing a cup of this dark brew was already, perhaps unintentionally, creating new social dynamics. It wasn't just drunk at home, it was shared, debated over, experienced collectively. This laid the groundwork for the next crucial development, the creation of dedicated spaces for this consumption. But that's a story for later. For now, you're just witnessing the first ripples. Merchants unloading sacks, the curious sniffing the aroma, the brave few taking a tentative sip. The word is spreading, Kawa. It's here. It's different. And nobody quite knows what to make of it yet, or the profound changes it's about to bring to the very fabric of Ottoman society. The cautious sips taken in back rooms and private homes are the quiet prologue to the bustling, controversial world of the Ottoman coffee house. Think of it as the Ottoman equivalent of the first time people tried energy drinks. It tastes weird, makes my heart race, but wow, I can finally finish that scroll! Except instead of Mountain Dew, it was a hot, sludgy brew from mysterious beans. And instead of just annoying your parents with your hyperactivity, you might be accidentally challenging centuries of tradition. No pressure. The beans themselves were a marvel. They came from far away, from lands with different customs and climates. How were they grown? How were they processed? The mystique surrounding the source added to the aura of the drink. It was exotic, a taste of the wider world brought right to the heart of the empire. This exoticism was part of its initial appeal, a little bit of foreign adventure in every cup. So, the first sip is taken. It's a small moment in time, easily missed amidst the grandeur and complexity of the 16th century Ottoman Empire. But this single act, the introduction of coffee, is the tiny spark that will ignite a cultural firestorm, leading to the creation of unique social spaces and a whole set of peculiar rules to govern them. The cautious sips are just the beginning of a long, complicated, and often dramatic relationship between the Ottomans and their beloved, controversial brew. You've had your first taste, metaphorically speaking, of the journey we're about to embark on. That cautious sip, remember? It wasn't just about the taste or the jolt. It was about a shared experience. You didn't just drink this peculiar brew alone in your kitchen. You offered it to guests. You shared it with fellow merchants after a long day in the bazaar, maybe even snuck a cup with a friend in a quiet courtyard. And as more people tried it and felt its effects, the desire for a dedicated space, a place where this new ritual could be performed communally, began to bubble up, much like the coffee itself in the boiling pot. Think about the social landscape of 16th century Istanbul. Where did people gather? The mosque was for prayer and religious discussion. The bazaar was for commerce. Homes were for family and close friends. There wasn't really a public, secular space specifically designed for leisure and conversation among men from different walks of life. Taverns existed, but they were often associated with alcohol, which, as we touched on, was problematic for many Muslims and generally frowned upon by the authorities. Coffee offered an alternative. A stimulating drink that didn't intoxicate, a reason to linger and talk. And so, the coffee house was born. The story goes that the first true coffee houses, distinct establishments dedicated solely to the serving and consumption of coffee, appeared in Istanbul around the mid-16th century, shortly after the drink's arrival. These weren't grand palaces initially. They were likely humble affairs, perhaps converted rooms in existing buildings, maybe even just mats laid out in a suitable spot with a fire pit for brewing. But they offered something revolutionary, a public living room. Imagine stepping into one of these early spots. The air isn't filled with the chatter of the marketplace or the hushed tones of the mosque. Instead, there's a low hum of conversation, the rhythmic grinding of beans, the hiss and bubble of water boiling, and that unmistakable, rich aroma of roasting coffee. It's warm, perhaps a bit smoky, and immediately feels different. You see people sitting on mats or low stools, clustered around small tables or simply facing each other, cups in hand. The decor was probably simple at first, focusing on functionality. Maybe some cushions for comfort, a few simple lamps as dusk fell, and the essential equipment, copper pots, sieves, small cups, fincans, and the roasting and grinding tools. Patrons would sit, often for hours, talking, listening, watching the world go by through the open doorway. It wasn't just about drinking the coffee. It was about the atmosphere, the company, the escape from the routines of daily life. Why did they catch on so quickly? Several reasons. Firstly, novelty. Coffee was new and exciting. People were curious to try it and experience its effects. Secondly, it was a social leveler, at least initially. Men from different classes and professions could potentially find themselves sitting side by side, sharing the same brew. A merchant might chat with a soldier, a scholar with an artisan. These interactions were less common in other established social spaces. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, they filled a void. They were places for people to gather, relax, exchange news, and simply be outside of work or home. It was the Ottoman equivalent of the local pub, but with caffeine instead of ale. It offered a sense of community and belonging. A mainstream historical fact is that the two earliest and most famous coffee houses in Istanbul are said to have been established around 1555, coinciding with the general arrival date of coffee. They were reportedly named Kivahan and Tofain, opened by Syrian merchants. These names have become almost legendary in coffee history, marking the formal beginning of the coffee house as an institution. However, like much of this early history, the details are a little hazy. Historians still argue whether Kivahan and Tofain were truly the first dedicated coffee houses, or simply the first ones significant enough to be recorded or remembered. Were there earlier, less formal spots that predated them? Were they purpose-built or converted spaces? The exact nature and location of the very first establishment are subjects of ongoing debate among scholars. It's like trying to pinpoint the exact moment someone first thought, "Hey, let's put seats in here and sell just this weird bean juice." A quirky or fringe tidbit about these early houses is that they might have been quite sparse by modern standards. Accounts suggest comfort was secondary to function. Patrons might have sat on the floor or low benches, and the focus was entirely on the coffee and the conversation it fueled. There weren't elaborate menus or plush furnishings. It was raw, simple, and centered around the ritual of brewing and drinking the dark, stimulating liquid. Imagine your favorite cafe stripped down to just the bare essentials: a kettle, some cups, and a place to sit. Maybe a cat wandering around. Definitely a cat. The speed at which these places proliferated is astonishing. Once the idea took hold, coffee houses started popping up all over Istanbul and then across the empire. They became integral to the urban landscape, hubs of activity and information exchange. The simple act of opening a place to sell coffee created a new kind of public sphere, a space where ideas, rumors, and opinions could flow freely, fueled by caffeine. This rapid rise in popularity, while great for the coffee house owners and their patrons, immediately raised eyebrows among others. Anything that gathers large groups of people outside of traditional structures tends to make those in power a little nervous. What were they really talking about in there? Who was meeting whom? The very success of the coffee house sowed the first seeds of suspicion. It wasn't just a place to grab a drink. It was becoming a new kind of social institution, one that existed independently of the mosque or the palace, and that independence was seen by some as potentially dangerous. You're sitting there, sipping your coffee, feeling that novel alertness spread through you. You're surrounded by the murmur of voices, the clinking of cups. You're part of something new, something exciting. But you can also feel the weight of tradition, the watchful eyes of a society trying to understand and control this sudden shift in social dynamics. The simple coffee house, born out of a desire for a shared sip, is already becoming a focal point for cultural tension and official scrutiny. This new social space, seemingly innocuous, is about to become a battleground. You're sitting there, remember, feeling that novel alertness from the kahwa, surrounded by the low hum of conversation in this brand new kind of space. It feels exciting, a little daring even, this public living room outside the usual structures. But that feeling of excitement wasn't shared by everyone. Far from it. While patrons were discovering the joys of caffeine-fueled chat, powerful figures were watching with deeply furrowed brows. The rapid rise of these coffee houses sparked immediate and intense suspicion from two main camps: the state authorities, represented by the Sultan and his officials, and the religious establishment, the powerful ulama, Islamic scholars. Why the fear? Well, think about it from their perspective. For centuries, social interaction in the Ottoman Empire was largely confined to established, controllable spaces. The mosque was for prayer and religious guidance, overseen by imams and the ulama. The court and government buildings were for official business and political maneuvering, strictly controlled by the Sultan's administration. The bazaar was for commerce, monitored by market inspectors. Homes were private. Where did people just hang out and talk about whatever was on their minds, potentially including criticisms of those in power or interpretations of religious matters that differed from the official line? Nowhere, really. Not in a public, easily accessible way for large numbers of men from varied backgrounds. Suddenly, these coffee houses popped up, seemingly out of nowhere. They were popular, they were drawing crowds, and crucially, they were spaces where people were talking, and talking, and talking. What were they talking about? That was the terrifying question for the authorities. Rumors could spread like wildfire. Discontent could find a voice. Ideas, even dangerous ones, could be exchanged freely, fueled by this stimulating new drink that kept people awake and animated. It was a breeding ground for gossip, yes, but also potentially for sedition. Imagine the Sultan's spies reporting back. "They're not just discussing trade routes, Your Majesty. They're muttering about taxes and the price of grain." This uncontrolled flow of information and opinion was a direct challenge to a state that relied on maintaining order and controlling the narrative. The religious establishment had their own set of anxieties. The ulama were the guardians of Islamic law and tradition. They looked at coffee and saw something new, something that wasn't mentioned in the Quran or the Hadith. Was it permissible? Its stimulating effect raised questions. Was it like wine, which is forbidden? While it didn't intoxicate in the same way, it altered one's state. Could it be considered haram, forbidden? Beyond the drink itself, the coffee houses fostered a culture of leisure. Men were spending hours there, chatting, playing games, backgammon and chess became popular, listening to stories, instead of being at the mosque or working. This seemed like idleness, a distraction from religious duties and productive labor. The social mixing also worried them. Men from different classes, even different ethnic or religious backgrounds, though primarily Muslim men initially, were mingling in ways that weren't traditional. A mainstream historical fact is that the introduction of coffee houses indeed triggered significant opposition from both the state and religious authorities almost immediately after their appearance in Istanbul in the mid-16th century. Decrees were issued, and religious opinions, fatwas, were solicited or spontaneously generated, expressing deep concern or outright condemnation. The fears weren't entirely unfounded from the perspective of maintaining the status quo. Coffee houses did become centers for political discussion, rumor-mongering, and the formation of social bonds that existed outside the traditional power structures. They were places where public opinion could coalesce, even if only locally, and that potential for collective sentiment, unchecked, was a major threat. It's like suddenly everyone got Twitter, but instead of their phones, they had tiny coffee cups, and instead of 280 characters, they had hours of uninterrupted chat time. And no algorithm to control trending topics. A quirky or fringe tidbit relates to some of the more outlandish fears circulating. Beyond sedition and idleness, some religious figures reportedly worried that the dark color of the coffee indicated a connection to the forbidden, perhaps even something demonic. Others were concerned about the roasting process, seeing the transformation of the bean by fire as potentially impure. It wasn't just about the social effects. For some, there was a genuine, almost superstitious, fear about the physical substance itself and its preparation. Imagine thinking your morning espresso was brewed with a hint of brimstone. Makes that bitter taste take on a whole new meaning, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for suppressing coffee houses was religious zeal or political control. Was it genuinely about upholding Islamic principles and preventing moral decay? Or was it primarily a pragmatic move by the state to shut down potential centers of dissent and assembly that they couldn't easily monitor? It was likely a complex mix of both, with religious arguments providing a convenient justification for state intervention. The Sultan could say he was acting on the advice of the pious ulama, while also conveniently neutralizing a potential threat to his power. The tension was palpable. On one side you had the surging popularity of a new social space offering connection and stimulation. On the other, you had the entrenched powers of state and religion viewing it with profound suspicion, seeing it as a source of idleness, moral corruption, and political instability. The stage was set for a conflict, a battle over the very right to gather, talk, and drink coffee in public. The simple act of brewing and serving coffee was about to become a political and religious flashpoint. The whispers of sedition in the coffee houses were echoing all the way to the palace and the grand mosques, and those echoes were not welcomed. So you're feeling that buzz, right? That awake, alive feeling from the coffee, surrounded by people in this new, exciting space. But remember how not everyone was thrilled about this. While the Sultan's court eyed the coffee houses with suspicion for political reasons, worrying about sedition and uncontrolled gatherings, the other major power bloc, the ulama, the learned scholars and religious authorities, had a different, but equally potent, set of concerns. For them, it wasn't just about potential rebellion, it was about potential damnation. The ulama saw themselves as the guardians of Islamic law and tradition, the interpreters of divine will. When something new and wildly popular appeared, something that wasn't part of the established social or religious order, they had to scrutinize it. And coffee, and the places where it was consumed, raised massive red flags for them. Their opposition wasn't just a mild disapproval. For many, it was a matter of grave religious principle. Was this drink permissible? Were these gathering places moral? Their arguments were multifaceted, rooted in theological interpretation and social observation. The most prominent concern revolved around the nature of coffee itself. They debated whether its stimulating effect was akin to intoxication, even in a mild form. Islamic law strictly forbids the consumption of alcohol, wine, and the word kahwa was sometimes used in classical Arabic poetry to refer to wine. This linguistic overlap, combined with the noticeable physical and mental effects of the drink, led some scholars to argue that coffee fell under the same prohibition as wine. It altered your state of mind and body, therefore, it must be haram, forbidden. Imagine the theological headache. Is staying awake for prayer the same as getting tipsy? Apparently, for some, the line was blurry. Beyond the drink itself, the ulama strongly disapproved of the environment and activities within the coffee houses. They saw these places as dens of idleness and distraction. Men were spending hours there, chatting, playing games like backgammon and chess, which some scholars also viewed with suspicion, listening to storytellers, instead of being in the mosque praying, reading the Quran, or fulfilling their work and family obligations. This was seen as a waste of precious time, a diversion from the pious life. It was the Ottoman equivalent of religious leaders complaining that people were spending too much time on social media instead of attending services. Except, with more turbans and less scrolling. Furthermore, the social mixing within coffee houses was problematic for some conservative scholars. While primarily frequented by Muslim men, the relaxed atmosphere and the fact that men from different social strata and professions mingled freely went against some traditional norms of social segregation. The potential for gossip, slander, and the spread of rumors in such uncontrolled environments was also a major concern, seen as harmful to the social fabric and individual piety. These religious objections weren't just whispered among scholars. They were formalized into fatwas, official religious rulings. Prominent members of the ulama issued condemnations, declaring coffee and/or coffee houses haram. These rulings carried significant weight, potentially influencing public opinion and providing religious justification for state intervention. The Sultan might have political reasons to close coffee houses, but a fatwa from a respected Sheikh ul-Islam, the highest religious authority, gave that action divine sanction. It was a powerful alliance of religious and state power against the humble coffee bean. A mainstream historical fact is that several prominent Ottoman religious scholars, ulama, did indeed issue fatwas against coffee in coffee houses starting in the mid-16th century, citing reasons ranging from its perceived intoxicating nature to the negative social effects of the coffee houses themselves. These rulings were a significant factor in the official attempts to suppress coffee culture. The vehemence of the ulama's opposition highlights the depth of the cultural shock coffee houses represented. They weren't just debating a beverage, they were debating a fundamental shift in how Ottoman men spent their time, interacted with each peers, and accessed information. It challenged the mosque's role as the primary public gathering space and the traditional hierarchy of social interaction. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this religious debate is that some ulama argued against coffee because the method of roasting the beans involved fire, and things touched by fire were sometimes considered impure or less holy in certain contexts, particularly food items. This is a less common argument than the intoxication or idleness concerns, but it shows the lengths to which some scholars went to find reasons to condemn the novelty. Imagine saying your morning toast is less pious because it's been near a flame. It adds a whole new layer to burned offerings. Historians still argue whether the ulama's opposition was primarily a genuine theological concern based on their understanding of Islamic law and tradition, or if it was more of a reaction to the socio-political changes coffee houses facilitated, with religious arguments serving as a convenient and powerful tool to resist those changes and maintain their own authority. Was it truly about piety, or about preserving the established order and the ulama's place within it? It's likely, as with the state's motives, a complex interplay of both. Despite the stern pronouncements and the weight of religious authority behind them, the ulama's condemnations faced a formidable challenge: the immense popularity of coffee in coffee houses among the populace. People liked the drink, they liked the spaces, and they weren't easily dissuaded by religious arguments alone, especially when other scholars offered counter-arguments or more lenient interpretations, finding ways to declare coffee permissible. This internal debate within the ulama itself weakened the uniformity of the religious opposition. So, while you're enjoying your coffee and the lively conversation, know that outside those walls, powerful religious figures are debating your very right to be there, citing ancient texts and expressing fears about your soul and the moral fiber of society. The ulama's condemnation was a serious threat, providing the ideological fuel for the state's more practical efforts to control or eliminate these upstart gathering places. It was a battle of ideas, traditions, and power, all swirling around that simple, dark cup you hold in your hand. And this religious opposition paved the way for the next phase, the actual attempts to shut these places down. So you're sitting there, right? Sipping that revolutionary brew, feeling wide awake, maybe debating the price of spices or the Sultan's latest decree with the fellow patrons. But outside the cozy, smoky confines of your coffee house, the storm is gathering. Remember those furrowed brows and the worried whispers from the ulama and the palace officials we talked about? Well, they weren't just going to sit back and let this new phenomenon flourish unchecked. The fears about sedition, idleness, and potential haram activities quickly translated into action. The state, often egged on by the religious authorities, decided it was time to crack down. Various sultans throughout the 16th and 17th centuries took turns trying to curb the spread and influence of coffee houses. These weren't just polite requests to maybe close a little earlier, these were often serious attempts at outright prohibition. Imagine your favorite cafe being declared illegal overnight. That's the kind of pressure these early establishments faced. The motivations were a potent cocktail: the state's desire for political control, the ulama's religious objections, and sometimes, perhaps, a genuine concern about public order or the perceived moral decay caused by these new leisure spaces. The methods of prohibition varied, ranging from official decrees and heavy taxation to forced closures and even, sometimes, violent raids. Sultans like Murad III, Ahmed I, and especially Murad IV became known for their strict measures against coffee houses. Decrees would be issued, often citing both the political dangers of uncontrolled assembly and the religious arguments about coffee being forbidden. These decrees weren't always consistently enforced, but they hung like a constant threat over the coffee house owners and their patrons. It was like having a perpetual "going out of business, maybe?" sign hanging over the door. Forced closures were common. Officials or janissaries, the elite infantry units, often used for enforcing internal order, would arrive, sometimes without warning, force everyone out, and padlock or even demolish the establishment. Imagine the scene: you're mid-sentence, deep in a discussion about the latest gossip from the top copy palace, and suddenly the doors burst open and stern-faced guards are telling everyone to leave. Not exactly conducive to a relaxing afternoon. Punishments for owners and patrons caught violating the bans could be severe, as we'll touch on more later. Simply being found in a coffee house could lead to arrest, beatings, or worse. For owners, it could mean ruin, imprisonment, or even execution if they were deemed particularly defiant, or if their establishment was linked to genuine political unrest. It was a high-stakes game just for the privilege of serving and sipping coffee. Your loyalty card might get you a free cup, but breaking the rules could cost you your head. Despite these harsh measures and repeated attempts at prohibition, the coffee houses proved remarkably resilient. Why? Public resistance was a major factor. People loved coffee, and they loved the social space the coffee houses provided. They had become deeply ingrained in the urban social fabric surprisingly quickly. For many men, they were essential spaces for socializing, networking, and escaping the pressures of work or crowded homes. Trying to take that away was like trying to tell people they couldn't breathe the air. They might comply under direct threat, but they'd find ways around it. Economic interests also played a role. Coffee trading and coffee house ownership became profitable ventures, creating a class of people who had a vested interest in keeping them open. Bribes and informal payments to officials to look the other way were likely common, undermining the state's enforcement efforts. It's hard to enforce a ban when the local official is getting a cut of the profits, or a free cup every morning. Enforcement was difficult to sustain across a sprawling empire, and even within a large city like Istanbul. There were simply too many coffee houses, often tucked away in side streets and neighborhoods, for the authorities to monitor effectively all the time. Bans would be announced with great fanfare, raids would occur, but then, as the immediate pressure subsided, new coffee houses would pop up or old ones would quietly reopen. It was a constant game of cat and mouse. A mainstream historical fact is that Ottoman sultans, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries, issued multiple decrees attempting to ban or severely restrict coffee houses due to fears of political assembly and religious objections, though these bans were rarely permanent or fully effective. The public's attachment to coffee houses wasn't just about the drink, it was about the culture that had quickly formed around them. They were centers for news, entertainment, and social connection. Taking away the coffee house wasn't just taking away a beverage, it was dismantling a vital part of urban life. People weren't just resisting a rule, they were defending a way of life they had quickly come to cherish. A quirky or fringe tidbit involves the ingenuity of coffee house owners and patrons in evading the bans. Some reports suggest that during periods of strict prohibition, coffee might be served in secret rooms, or patrons would gather in private homes that functioned unofficially as temporary coffee houses. There were even stories of coffee being brewed and served from boats on the Bosphorus to avoid land-based raids. Imagine ordering your coffee to go, via rowboat. It gives a whole new meaning to a drive-through. Historians still argue whether the repeated failure of these prohibition attempts was primarily due to the sheer popularity and public demand for coffee houses, the economic forces that supported them, or the inherent difficulty of consistently enforcing such bans in a large and complex urban environment. Was it the will of the people, the power of the purse, or the practical limits of state control that ultimately allowed coffee houses to survive and eventually thrive? It was likely a combination of all these factors, creating a dynamic tension between state power and popular culture. So, you're in the coffee house, enjoying the buzz and the chatter, but you're also acutely aware that this haven could be shut down at any moment. The risk adds a layer of excitement, perhaps even defiance, to the simple act of sharing a cup. The attempts at prohibition, while often unsuccessful in the long run, highlight just how seriously the authorities viewed these places and how fiercely the populace clung to them. This push and pull, this constant negotiation between control and freedom, is a defining feature of the early history of coffee houses in the Ottoman Empire. The bans failed, but they forced the culture to adapt, to become resilient, and to develop its own set of rules and codes, both formal and informal, to survive the scrutiny of the state. Okay, so the outright bans didn't exactly work, did they? You saw the sultans try, you saw the ulama condemn, you even saw janissaries kicking people out. But the coffee houses just kept popping back up like stubborn weeds in a perfectly manicured imperial garden. The demand was too high, the profits too tempting, and the public resistance, both active and passive, too widespread. Trying to eliminate coffee houses entirely was like trying to scoop the Bosphorus dry with a teacup. It was clear the state needed a different approach. If you can't beat M, regulate M. That became the reluctant strategy. Since they couldn't make coffee houses disappear, the authorities decided to try and control them. They shifted from prohibition to formal regulation, issuing decrees and laws aimed at managing what happened inside these bustling, often suspicious, establishments. These weren't just informal guidelines. These were official rules handed down from the top, meant to bring the wild, untamed world of the coffee house under the Sultan's watchful eye. Imagine a stack of official scrolls being delivered to every coffee house owner. Here are the new rules, fellas. Read 'em and weep, or maybe just read 'em and pay up. These regulations covered a surprising range of activities, reflecting the various fears the authorities had. They wanted to control who went there, when they went there, and most importantly, what they did and said while they were there. One major target of regulation was the hours of operation. Since coffee kept people awake and coffee houses were seen as potential hotbeds for plotting and sedition, decrees were often issued limiting how late they could stay open, especially after dark. The fear was that under the cloak of night, fueled by caffeine, patrons would be discussing things they shouldn't, away from prying eyes. Trying to tell a room full of caffeinated, chatty patrons that it's bedtime? Good luck with that. You'd probably get a lecture on the geopolitical implications of the spice trade instead of them packing up quietly. Another area of control was the clientele. While coffee houses initially attracted men from different walks of life, there were later attempts to regulate who could frequent which establishments, sometimes based on profession or social status, though this was harder to enforce. More successfully, authorities sometimes tried to prevent certain groups, particularly janissaries, from congregating in specific coffee houses in large numbers, fearing they might plot against the Sultan or cause unrest. Remember, the janissaries were powerful and sometimes volatile. Keeping them out of spaces where they could easily organize was a smart, albeit difficult, move for the state. The activities within the coffee houses also came under scrutiny. While games like backgammon and chess were incredibly popular, some religious authorities and state officials viewed them as distractions or even forms of gambling, leading to decrees attempting to limit or ban them. Storytelling, too, while a beloved form of entertainment, could be dangerous if the stories contained veiled criticisms of the government or promoted rebellious ideas. So, decrees might warn against allowing inappropriate performances or discussions. Imagine a historical open mic night being shut down because the poet's metaphors were a little too pointed about the Sultan's tax policy. A mainstream historical fact is that Sultan Murad IV, reigned 1623 to 1640, was particularly known for his harsh decrees against coffee houses, sometimes making their operation punishable by death, alongside bans on tobacco and alcohol. While such extreme measures were often temporary or inconsistently applied, they demonstrate the seriousness with which the state viewed the perceived threat posed by these establishments, and the lengths they would go to control them. Beyond the activities and hours, the physical location of coffee houses was also sometimes regulated. Authorities preferred them to be in open, visible locations rather than tucked away in labyrinthine alleys where monitoring was difficult. There might also be regulations regarding their structure or size, though these were less common than rules about behavior and hours. It was all about visibility and control. If you can see them, you can keep an eye on them. If they're hidden away, who knows what brewing is happening, both literally and figuratively? The price of coffee itself could even be subject to regulation, especially during times of scarcity or economic hardship. The state might set official prices to prevent gouging or speculation, another way of exerting control over this valuable commodity, and the businesses built around it. Trying to explain price controls to a room full of patrons just trying to get their caffeine fix sounds like a truly exhausting bureaucratic nightmare. These formal regulations were a constant source of tension between the state and the coffee house community. Owners and patrons would try to find loopholes, bribe officials, or simply ignore the rules when they thought they could get away with it. The effectiveness of the decrees waxed and waned depending on the sultan, the strictness of the grand vizier, and the diligence, or venality, of the local enforcement officers. A decree might be strictly enforced for a few months after it was issued, only for things to loosen up again until the next crackdown. A quirky or fringe tidbit about these regulations is that some decrees reportedly mandated specific types of patrons for certain coffee houses, attempting to formalize the social segregation that sometimes emerged naturally. For example, there might be attempts to designate certain establishments for merchants, others for artisans, and so on, trying to prevent the mixing of classes that the authorities found unsettling. It was an early, state-mandated form of social sorting, though likely as difficult to enforce as trying to tell pigeons not to gather in the square. Historians still argue whether these formal regulations were primarily effective in controlling coffee houses or if they merely drove certain activities underground and created opportunities for corruption. Did they genuinely curb sedition and idleness? Or did they simply make life more difficult for legitimate business owners while the truly dangerous conversations just moved to less visible locations? It's a classic debate about the effectiveness of top-down control versus the resilience of popular social practices. So, you're sitting there, perhaps glancing nervously towards the door every time you hear heavy footsteps outside. The threat of outright closure is still there, but now you also have a complex web of official rules to navigate. Don't stay too late, don't discuss that topic too loudly, make sure you're in the right kind of coffee house for your profession. The simple act of enjoying a cup of coffee has become entangled with state control, a constant reminder that even in your moments of leisure and conversation, the eyes of the empire might be watching, and the long arm of the law might be reaching for your fincan. So, you've navigated the tricky waters of official state decrees, avoiding the late-night crackdowns, perhaps pretending you're just tying your shoe outside when the janissaries stroll by, or maybe even bribing a local official with a particularly fragrant blend of coffee beans. But surviving the Ottoman coffee house wasn't just about dodging the Sultan's formal rules. Once you stepped inside, there was a whole other layer of complexity, the unwritten codes, the informal rules of etiquette that governed behavior among the patrons themselves. Think of it like stepping into someone's very crowded, very public living room. There might not be a sign on the wall saying, "Don't talk about the Sultan's mother," but everyone knew there were lines you didn't cross, ways you were expected to behave, and rituals you were meant to respect. These weren't laws enforced by guards. They were social norms enforced by disapproving glances, subtle shifts in conversation, or the cold shoulder from fellow patrons. It was the original social contract, brewed over a slow fire. These unwritten rules, sometimes referred to collectively as adab al-kawa, etiquette of coffee, developed organically as these spaces became central to urban life. They were about maintaining order, ensuring comfort for everyone, and fostering a sense of community. If you wanted to be a welcome regular, you had to learn the ropes, and fast. You couldn't just barge in, yell your order, gulp your coffee, and leave. That would be like showing up to a tea ceremony in sweatpants and chugging from the pot. Just wrong. One fundamental rule was about respect. Respect for the space, respect for the coffee maker, the kavasi, and respect for your fellow patrons. This meant keeping your voice at a reasonable level, especially during performances or storytelling. It meant not interrupting others' conversations, even if you had a burning hot take on the latest rumors from the harem. It meant understanding the subtle hierarchy of seating, though this could vary. Sometimes elders got the best spots, sometimes it was regulars, sometimes it just depended on who got there first. The ritual of ordering and serving coffee itself was steeped in informal rules. You didn't just shout for a coffee, you'd signal the courtesy with a glance or a quiet word. The serving was often done with a certain grace, the small cup, fincan, placed carefully before you. There was an expectation that you would linger, savor the drink, and engage in conversation. Finishing your coffee too quickly and leaving could be seen as rude, as if you were just using the place for a quick fix rather than participating in the social scene. It was the opposite of a modern grab-and-go culture. It was all about the sit and savor. Paying wasn't always an immediate transaction either. In many coffee houses, especially for regulars, tabs were kept, or payment was made upon leaving, sometimes for multiple cups consumed over hours. This implied a level of trust and belonging. You weren't just a customer, you were part of the furniture, albeit furniture that occasionally offered opinions on the state of the empire. Beyond general politeness, there were rules specific to the activities within the coffee house. If a storyteller, meta, was performing, you were expected to listen attentively, reacting appropriately with laughter or gasps at the right moments. If a game of backgammon was underway, you didn't lean over and offer unsolicited advice, no matter how obvious the winning move seemed to you. Unless, of course, you wanted to start a small, coffee-fueled skirmish. A mainstream historical fact is that the development of specific etiquette surrounding coffee consumption and behavior in coffee houses became a recognized aspect of Ottoman social culture. Texts from the period and later historical accounts describe the expected decorum, emphasizing politeness, quiet conversation, at times, and respect for the social space. These unwritten rules served a vital purpose, particularly given the state's suspicion. By presenting themselves as orderly, respectable gathering places where men engaged in polite conversation and leisure, coffee houses could subtly push back against the image of them as dens of sedition and debauchery. The patrons were, in a way, policing themselves to ensure the survival of their beloved spaces. "See, Sultan? We're just having a nice chat about poetry, not plotting your overthrow." Mostly. A quirky or fringe tidbit about this etiquette relates to the pouring of the coffee. It was considered polite to leave a small amount of sediment, the coffee grounds, at the bottom of the fincan. Draining the cup completely was sometimes seen as the mark of a glutton or someone who didn't appreciate the nuance of the drink and the ritual. So, leaving that sludgy bit at the end wasn't just about avoiding a mouthful of grounds. It was a subtle signal that you knew the score, that you were a person of refinement, or at least someone who had been to a coffee house before. Your ability to leave dregs was a social marker. Historians still argue whether these unwritten rules primarily emerged from genuine cultural norms of politeness and community building, or if they were also a conscious or semi-conscious strategy by coffee house owners and patrons to manage the authorities' perceptions and avoid crackdowns by projecting an image of harmless respectability. Was it purely organic social development, or a form of cultural self-preservation? It was likely a bit of both, as the threat of closure undoubtedly encouraged patrons to put their best, most orderly foot forward. So you're sitting there, navigating this complex web of unspoken rules. You nod respectfully to the elder gentleman in the corner, you laugh at the appropriate moment during the storyteller's tale, you make sure to leave a respectable layer of sediment in your cup, and you keep your voice down when discussing anything remotely sensitive. You're not just drinking coffee, you're performing a social dance, participating in a centuries-old ritual governed by invisible strings. You've mastered the art of ordering, the art of sipping, and the even more difficult art of simply being in this unique, vibrant, and subtly controlled social space. But all this sitting and talking, even when following the rules, couldn't entirely mask the fact that these places were breeding grounds for something the authorities truly feared: information exchange, opinion formation, and potentially dissent. So, you've become a regular. You know the Cavasi's name, you know where the best light is for reading a manuscript, or pretending to, and you've mastered the subtle art of leaving just the right amount of sediment in your fincan. You're following the unwritten rules, being polite, listening attentively to the storyteller, and generally projecting an image of harmless, respectable leisure. But despite all your best efforts to blend in and avoid trouble, the very nature of the coffee house made it inherently risky, particularly when it came to what you and your fellow patrons were talking about. Remember how the authorities were terrified of uncontrolled gatherings? This section is the payoff for that fear. Because while you might start with polite pleasantries about the weather or the quality of the latest shipment of coffee beans, conversations in a coffee house had a tendency to drift. And where they often drifted was towards the topics that were most interesting, most pressing, and most dangerous: gossip, politics, and the rumblings of discontent against the ruling power. Think about it. Here you are, in a space outside the direct oversight of the mosque or the workplace. You're surrounded by men from different backgrounds: merchants, artisans, soldiers, scholars, civil servants. They've all experienced the empire from different angles. They've heard different rumors in the bazaar. They have different grievances. Fuel them with a stimulating drink that makes you feel awake and animated, and give them hours to sit and talk, and what do you get? A perfect environment for the free flow of information, opinions, and sometimes dangerous ideas. It was the Ottoman equivalent of the internet comments section, but with real people, face to face, and the potential for actual consequences beyond getting ratioed. Gossip was, of course, rampant. Who was up, who was down in the Sultan's court? Which pasha was rumored to be corrupt? What scandal was unfolding in the wealthy neighborhoods? This kind of talk might seem harmless, but in an autocratic society where reputations could be made or broken by whispers, even gossip held power. It shaped public perception and could undermine trust in authority figures. But the conversation didn't stop at salacious rumors. It inevitably moved to more substantive matters: the burden of taxes, the price of essential goods, the conduct of government officials, the latest military campaigns, the perceived injustices of the ruling system. These were not topics you could easily discuss loudly in the street or in the mosque. The coffee house offered a degree of anonymity in the crowd, a sense of shared space where grievances could be aired and opinions exchanged with relative freedom, at least compared to other public venues. This made coffee houses potential hotbeds for political discussion and dissent. A group of disgruntled janissaries might gather to grumble about their pay or their commanders. Merchants might complain about trade regulations or corrupt customs officials. Scholars might debate interpretations of law or criticize the Sultan's policies under the guise of academic discussion. These conversations, seemingly innocent to the participants, were viewed with intense suspicion by the state. They represented the formation of public opinion outside of official channels, the potential for collective grievance to solidify into organized opposition. Imagine the paranoia in the Topkapi Palace. Spies and informants, more on them later, would report back snippets of conversation overheard in coffee houses. They were talking about the Sultan's health, Your Majesty. They questioned the wisdom of the recent decree, Your Majesty. They laughed at the Grand Vizier, Your Majesty. Each report, no matter how trivial, fueled the fear that these places were undermining the very foundations of imperial authority. It was like the Sultan was constantly scrolling through a feed of live, unfiltered public sentiment, and he did not like what he was reading. A mainstream historical fact is that Ottoman coffee houses were indeed widely recognized by authorities and observers of the time as centers for political discussion, rumor spreading, and potential dissent, leading to their frequent targeting for surveillance and suppression. This wasn't just a perceived threat. It was a documented reality that shaped state policy towards these establishments for centuries. The risk was real. Patrons had to be careful about what they said, and perhaps more importantly, who was listening. A casual remark could be misinterpreted, exaggerated, or deliberately reported to the authorities by an informant looking to curry favor or settle a score. The relaxed atmosphere of the coffee house masked a constant undercurrent of potential danger. You might be sharing a laugh over a story 1 minute and wondering if the quiet man in the corner is a spy the next. Talk about killing the vibe. A quirky or fringe tidbit relates to the use of coded language. Some accounts suggest that patrons in certain coffee houses developed subtle ways of discussing sensitive topics, using metaphors, allegories, or references to popular stories or characters to convey political points without explicitly naming names or criticizing the Sultan directly. It was like a subtle game of coded communication, where regulars understood the real meaning behind seemingly innocuous comments. Ah, yes, the lion in the fable certainly seems indecisive lately. Might be code for the Sultan isn't making strong decisions. Your history degree suddenly becomes a crash course in deciphering coded coffee talk. Historians still argue whether the coffee houses were genuinely significant incubators of organized political dissent, or if they were primarily spaces for blowing off steam and harmless grumbling that the state overreacted to. Were they truly plotting centers, or just places where people complained loudly because they couldn't do it anywhere else? The reality is likely somewhere in between, with genuine discontent finding expression alongside everyday gossip and complaints. The potential for trouble meant that even the unwritten rules could become politically charged. Knowing when not to speak, when to change the subject, or how to subtly signal disapproval of a dangerous conversation were crucial skills for survival. The seemingly simple act of sharing a cup of coffee became intertwined with the complex and perilous world of Ottoman politics. So you're sitting there, coffee cup in hand, listening to the murmur of voices. You hear the latest rumors about the Sultan's health, the complaints about the new tax on wool, the whispers about a pasha who just got executed. You contribute your own carefully worded opinions, always keeping one eye on the door and the other on the faces around you. You're in a space of leisure and community, yes, but you're also navigating a political minefield, where every word carries weight and the walls might just have ears, the ears of the Sultan's informants. The coffee house, born of a simple desire for a stimulating drink and shared space, had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous, a vital, unofficial forum where public opinion brewed, and where the very act of talking could be an act of defiance. So, you've been navigating the tricky world of Ottoman coffee houses, dodging the Sultan's bans, mastering the unwritten rules of etiquette, and maybe even trying to decipher the coded political chatter. But as you become a more seasoned patron, you start to notice something else. Not all coffee houses are the same. While some might attract a general mix of people, many others develop distinct identities, becoming specific haunts catering almost exclusively to particular professions, social classes, or even ethnic groups. It was like the Ottoman version of choosing your online forum. You went where your people hung out. Imagine walking down a bustling street in Istanbul. You pass one coffee house with the smell of fresh bread wafting from a nearby bakery, filled with men in simple clothes, their hands showing the wear of manual labor. This is likely a haunt for artisans or laborers. A bit further you see another, perhaps slightly grander, with men in finer fabrics, discussing trade routes and prices. This is probably a merchant's coffee house. Down by the docks, there's a rougher and ready spot frequented by sailors and dock workers, the air thick with sea salt and boisterous laughter. Even the janissaries, despite official attempts to prevent them from congregating, often had their preferred spots where they could talk shop, and perhaps plot, among themselves. This specialization wasn't usually mandated by the state initially. It emerged organically. People gravitated towards places where they felt comfortable, where they had shared interests and experiences. A cobbler had more in common with other cobblers than with a wealthy textile merchant, and their conversations, concerns, and even their jokes would be different. These specialized coffee houses became extensions of the guild halls or professional networks. They were places for networking, sharing trade secrets, or complaining about competitors, discussing working conditions, and solidifying professional bonds. For a young apprentice, knowing which coffee house his master frequented was as important as knowing how to stitch leather. For groups like the janissaries, these haunts were crucial for maintaining unit cohesion and discussing grievances away from the ears of their officers or the Sultan's spies, though, as we've seen, spies were everywhere. A janissary coffee house would have a different energy, perhaps more focused on military matters, unit gossip, and the ever-present undercurrent of political maneuvering within the corps. You definitely didn't want to wander into one of those and start complaining about the quality of the military rations unless you were part of the club. Beyond professions, there were coffee houses that catered to different social classes, though the lines could sometimes blur. A simpler establishment might serve laborers, while a more ornate one with better cushions and higher quality coffee might attract wealthier merchants or lower-level bureaucrats. While coffee houses were sometimes touted as social levelers, in practice, economic realities and social hierarchies often led to a de facto segregation, creating different tiers of coffee houses for different segments of society. It was a bit like having your local greasy spoon diner versus a fancy cafe with artisanal pour-overs. Same basic product, very different clientele and vibe. A mainstream historical fact is that coffee houses in Ottoman cities, particularly Istanbul, did become highly specialized by profession or social group. Guilds often had their preferred coffee houses, and certain establishments were known as haunts for specific military units, scholars, or merchants. This specialization was a defining feature of the urban coffee house landscape. This specialization had interesting consequences for the authorities. On the one hand, it might have made surveillance easier in some ways. If you wanted to know what the boatmen were complaining about, you sent your spy to the boatman's coffee house down by the Golden Horn. If you wanted to monitor the Janissaries, you focused on their known haunts. It was like having neatly labeled boxes of potential dissent. On the other hand, these specialized spaces could also be more insular, with tighter bonds of trust among the regulars, making it harder for outsiders, like spies, to infiltrate and gain genuine access to sensitive conversations. The shared identity created a protective bubble, albeit a fragile one. The unwritten rules we talked about could also vary slightly between these different haunts. While general politeness was expected everywhere, the specific topics of conversation that were acceptable, the level of formality, and even the preferred games or entertainment might differ. In a scholar's coffee house, you might hear debates on philosophy or theology, while in a merchant's, it would be about market prices and shipping news. In a storyteller's haunt, the focus would be entirely on the performance. You had to learn the specific adab of your chosen, or most frequented coffee house. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some of these specialized coffee houses even had nicknames related to their clientele or location. There might be the Butcher's Coffee House, the Janissaries' Corner, or the Scribe's Sip. These informal names reflected the strong identity tied to the groups that frequented them, and added another layer of local color to the urban landscape. Imagine trying to find the Cobbler's Kettle in a city with no street signs and 1,000 alleys. You need local knowledge, or just follow the faint smell of shoe polish mixed with coffee. Historians still argue whether the state ever actively encouraged this specialization as a form of social control, hoping to keep potentially troublesome groups separate and easier to monitor, or if it was purely a natural evolution driven by social and economic factors. Did the authorities see specialized coffee houses as a bug or a feature? Was it a deliberate divide-and-conquer strategy, or just something that happened and they later tried to exploit? Regardless of the reasons, these specific haunts became deeply embedded in the lives of their patrons. They were places of comfort, community, and shared identity. You weren't just a guy drinking coffee, you were a merchant among merchants, a janissary among janissaries, a craftsman among craftsmen. This sense of belonging was a powerful draw, making these specialized coffee houses incredibly popular and resilient, even in the face of official scrutiny. So, as you sit in your favorite coffee house, perhaps one known for attracting people in your line of work, you feel that sense of camaraderie. You can talk freely about the specific challenges and triumphs of your profession, knowing that the people around you understand. It feels safe, familiar, like a second home. But you also know that this very specialization, while comforting, might make you a more predictable target for surveillance. The shared identity that unites you also makes you visible to those who wish to monitor you. It's a complex trade-off, a peculiar feature of these vibrant, specialized corners of the Ottoman social world. And while you're sitting and chatting, don't forget what else is happening in these places. The entertainment, the stories, the performances that added another layer to the coffee house experience. So, you've found your niche, your specific haunt where the conversation flows easily among fellow merchants, or perhaps artisans, or maybe even disgruntled former officials who now spend their days complaining about the good old times. You've mastered the unwritten rules, you know whose opinion matters on the price of silk, and you can spot a potential informant from 50 paces. Or maybe just the guy who asks too many questions about your business. But the Ottoman coffee house experience wasn't just about sipping coffee and chatting, no matter how stimulating the brew or the conversation. These places were also vibrant centers of culture and entertainment, vital hubs for the oral tradition that kept stories, poems, and news alive in a world before mass media. Imagine the scene in your favorite coffee house as dusk begins to fall. The light dims, the oil lamps are lit, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The hum of general conversation starts to subside slightly, and a sense of anticipation fills the air. Why? Because the entertainment is about to begin. These weren't just places to get a caffeine fix. They were stages, performance venues where talented individuals captivated audiences with their words, music, and sometimes, even visual tricks. The most iconic figure of coffee house entertainment was the meta, the public storyteller. These were master performers, often standing in a designated spot, perhaps on a low platform or just leaning against a pillar, using only their voice, gestures, and maybe a prop or two, like a stick or a handkerchief, to bring characters and narratives to life. They told tales of ancient heroes, epic battles, faraway lands, cautionary fables, and often, stories reflecting contemporary life in Istanbul, sometimes with thinly veiled social or political commentary woven in. A good meta could transport you from the smoky coffee house to the battlefield or the Sultan's court with just the power of their voice. It was like Netflix, but live, interactive, and with significantly higher stakes if the storyteller accidentally insulted the wrong pasha in his narrative. Poets would also recite their work, sometimes established figures, sometimes aspiring bards hoping to gain recognition. The coffee house provided an informal stage for literary expression, a place where verses could be shared and debated among enthusiasts. Musicians, too, might perform, playing traditional instruments like the oud or saz, adding a melodic layer to the atmosphere, though elaborate musical performances were perhaps less common in the strictly controlled early periods compared to later, more relaxed times. Another popular form of entertainment, especially from the 17th century onwards, was the karagöz shadow play. This was a form of puppet theater where flat puppets were projected onto a screen using light, telling often humorous, sometimes satirical stories featuring stock characters like the witty Karagöz and his dim-witted friend Hasavat. These plays were incredibly popular and, like the meta-s stories, could sometimes contain subtle, or not so subtle, jabs at authority or social norms. Imagine a puppet show being a form of political satire. It sounds silly, but in the Ottoman context, it was a powerful way to critique the system without directly risking your neck, though the puppeteers still had to be careful not to go too far. A mainstream historical fact is that Ottoman coffee houses served as crucial centers for oral tradition and public entertainment, most famously hosting meta-storytellers and karagöz shadow puppet performances. These forms of entertainment were integral to the coffee house experience, and played a significant role in disseminating news, shaping popular opinion, and preserving cultural narratives. The inclusion of entertainment wasn't just about keeping patrons amused while they drank their coffee. It served multiple purposes. For the owners, it was a major draw, bringing in customers and keeping them lingering, and ordering more coffee. For the patrons, it offered a form of affordable, accessible entertainment outside the home, a chance to hear news, learn lessons through fables, laugh at relatable characters, and connect with their culture's rich oral heritage. For the empire, well, it was another thing to monitor. Was that storyteller really just telling a funny anecdote about a clumsy bureaucrat? Or was he subtly mocking the Grand Vizier? Were the Karagöz puppets just bickering, or were they acting out a coded criticism of imperial policy? The potential for subversive messages hidden within the entertainment added another layer of suspicion for the authorities. The relationship between the performers and the audience was often quite intimate. Patrons might interact with the meta, asking questions or offering suggestions, though usually only after the performance. Performers often relied on the generosity of the audience for their income, passing around a tray or hat for tips after the show. This created a direct connection, a sense of shared experience between the teller and the listeners. It wasn't a distant, formal performance. It was a communal event, fueled by caffeine and collective attention. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some meta-storytellers were so famous and beloved that they developed their own signature styles, catchphrases, or recurring characters, becoming celebrities in their own right within the coffeehouse circuit. Patrons might follow their favorite meta from one coffeehouse to another, much like modern fans following a band on tour, except the tour bus was probably a donkey cart, and the merchandise was maybe a signed handkerchief. Historians still argue whether the primary function of coffee house entertainment was simply leisure and cultural preservation, or if it also served as a vital, unofficial channel for disseminating information, expressing social grievances, and even subtly organizing resistance against the state, particularly during periods of strict censorship. Were these just shows, or were they also coded news broadcasts and political rallies? The presence of these performers transformed the coffee house from a simple drinking spot into a dynamic cultural space. It was a university of the streets, a newspaper delivered by word of mouth, a theater open to anyone who could afford a cup of coffee. You sat there, sipping your brew, surrounded by the rich aroma and the low murmur of the crowd, but your attention was fixed on the storyteller, transported by his words, laughing at the puppet's antics, or listening intently to a poet's verses. This vibrant world of entertainment, however, also made the coffee houses even more attractive targets for surveillance. Where there were crowds and captivating performances, there was also the potential for dangerous ideas to spread quickly and effectively, embedded within the fabric of a story or a joke. The state wasn't just worried about idle chatter, they were worried about the power of narrative, the influence of a charismatic performer on a caffeinated audience. The very things that made the coffee house so beloved also made it a potential threat, a stage not just for entertainment, but potentially for defiance. And who better to keep an eye on these stages than the Sultan's own network of spies and informers? So you're sitting there, right? Lost in the storyteller's epic, laughing at the Karagaz puppets, or maybe just enjoying the hum of conversation around you. It feels like a world away from the strictures of the palace or the formality of the mosque. It's a place of freedom, of shared culture, of connection. But remember how all this vibrancy and chatter made the authorities nervous? How the potential for dangerous ideas to spread through stories and conversations was a major concern. Well, the Ottoman state wasn't content just issuing decrees and hoping for the best. They had a more subtle, insidious tool at their disposal, a network of spies and informers, their eyes and ears planted right there among you, in the heart of the coffee house. Imagine it, you're mid-sentence, perhaps offering a carefully worded critique of the latest trade policy, and you glance over at the quiet man sipping his coffee across the room. Is he just a fellow patron, lost in his own thoughts? Or is he listening intently, filing away your words to report to some official later? This was the pervasive, unsettling reality of the coffee house under scrutiny. The state knew they couldn't shut them all down, and they couldn't possibly monitor every single conversation themselves. So, they outsourced the job, turning patron against patron, neighbor against neighbor. Who were these informers? They could be anyone. Perhaps they were paid agents of the Sultan's court or the Grand Vizier. Maybe they were local officials tasked with keeping tabs on their neighborhood coffee houses. Sometimes they might have been coffee house owners or their employees, pressured by the authorities to report anything suspicious if they wanted to keep their doors open. And sometimes, they were just ordinary patrons, eager to gain favor, settle a personal score, or perhaps even genuinely believing they were serving the empire by reporting potential troublemakers. It was a system built on suspicion and potential betrayal. You might be sharing a friendly game of backgammon with someone who, the moment your back is turned, is heading to the nearest official to denounce you. Talk about a bad sport. Their mission was simple: listen. Listen for seditious talk, for complaints about the Sultan or his government, for rumors that could undermine authority, for discussions that seemed to be organizing any kind of opposition. They were looking for keywords, for names of known dissidents, for unusually large gatherings of specific groups, like janissaries, who seemed to be plotting. Any scrap of potentially troublesome information could be valuable. It didn't have to be a full-blown conspiracy. Even a widely shared joke at the Sultan's expense could be reported as evidence of disrespect and disloyalty. This constant surveillance created an atmosphere of caution, even paranoia, within the coffee houses. While the surface might be lively and relaxed, there was always an underlying tension. You learned to read the room, to gauge who was listening, to know when to lower your voice, when to change the subject, or when to simply fall silent. The unwritten rules of etiquette took on a new dimension. politeness wasn't just about good manners, it was about survival. You didn't want to accidentally offend someone who might also be an informant. It was like trying to have a casual chat in a room full of microphones, only you didn't know where the microphones were, or who was holding the recording device. A mainstream historical fact is that the Ottoman state actively employed networks of spies and informers, *journalcy*, or similar terms, who frequented public spaces, including coffee houses, specifically to report on potentially seditious conversations and activities. This was a standard tool of governance in the empire, particularly intensified during periods of political instability or strict rule. The informers weren't always subtle. Sometimes you might suspect someone based on their behavior. They seemed too quiet, too observant, or they asked leading questions. Other times, the betrayal would come out of nowhere, when a patron was suddenly arrested based on words they thought were spoken only among friends. The fear of being reported was a powerful disincentive to openly criticize the state, even in the relative privacy of your favorite coffee house. It effectively extended the reach of the palace walls into the most popular public spaces. A quirky or fringe tidbit relates to the methods informants might use. Some accounts suggest they might try to subtly provoke conversation, perhaps by starting a complaint themselves to see who would agree or add their own grievances. Others might feign drunkenness, even though coffee isn't alcohol, or ignorance to encourage others to speak more freely. Imagine a guy pretending to be really annoyed about taxes, just to get you to spill your own feelings. It's like a historical focus group run by secret police, and the payment for participation might be a trip to the dungeon. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of informers in coffee houses was genuinely effective in preventing large-scale dissent and rebellion, or if it primarily served to create a climate of fear and distrust among the populace, leading to self-censorship rather than actually uncovering major plots. Did the state really stop revolutions this way, or did they just make everyone quieter and more suspicious? The constant threat of surveillance meant that the bonds formed in coffee houses, while often strong, were also fragile. Trust was a valuable commodity, harder to come by than even the rarest coffee bean. You learned to choose your companions carefully, to gauge their loyalty, to understand the subtle cues that indicated whether someone was safe to talk to. The lively debates and shared laughter were always underscored by the knowledge that a careless word could have serious consequences. So you're sitting there, nursing your coffee, listening to the storyteller weave his magic. You're part of the community, enjoying the warmth and camaraderie. But in the back of your mind, the question lingers: who is watching? Who is listening? The friendly face across the table, the quiet figure by the brazier, even the Kavasi himself. Any one of them could be the eyes and ears of the state. The peculiar rules of the Ottoman coffee house weren't just about etiquette. They were about survival in a space where leisure and conversation were constantly under the shadow of surveillance and the threat of denunciation. And if you weren't careful, those watchful eyes could lead directly to some rather unpleasant punishments. So you're sitting there, right? Enjoying the buzz, the chatter, the performance, but with that nagging awareness that someone might be listening, that a careless word could land you in trouble. Because while the coffee house offered a degree of freedom and anonymity, it wasn't a consequence-free zone. If you were caught breaking the rules, whether the formal decrees from the Sultan or the informal codes of conduct among patrons, there were penalties, and they could range from mildly embarrassing to truly terrifying. The peculiar nature of the Ottoman coffee house extended even to the ways rule breakers were dealt with. Let's start with the state's punishments. If you were caught in a coffee house during a period of prohibition, or if your establishment was deemed a center of sedition, the authorities weren't exactly handing out parking tickets. The penalties could be incredibly harsh, reflecting the seriousness with which the state viewed the potential threat posed by these places. For coffee house owners, repeat offenses could mean ruin. Their businesses could be confiscated, their property seized, and they themselves could face imprisonment, or even banishment. It was a constant gamble running one of these popular spots. For patrons, simply being present in a coffee house during a ban could lead to arrest and physical punishment. Beatings were not uncommon. Imagine getting flogged just for wanting a cup of coffee and a chat. It puts your worst Monday morning commute into perspective, doesn't it? During the reign of particularly strict sultans, like Murad IV, the punishments escalated dramatically. He was notorious for his zero-tolerance policy towards coffee houses, and alcohol and tobacco, and under his rule, the penalty for operating or even frequenting a coffee house could, theoretically, be death. While executions for this offense might not have been commonplace or consistently applied, the fact that it was even on the books shows the extreme level of fear and opposition these places generated in the highest levels of power. It was a literal life-or-death situation just to get your caffeine fix. Beyond the official state punishments, there were also consequences for violating the unwritten social codes within the coffee house itself. While these weren't enforced by guards with whips, they could still make your life miserable within that specific social sphere. If you were rude, disruptive, cheated at games, or consistently failed to show respect for the courtesy or the performers, you might find yourself subtly, or not so subtly, ostracized. Conversations would stop when you approached, nobody would want to play backgammon with you, and the courtesy might be suspiciously slow in serving your coffee, perhaps even accidentally giving you a finken full of grounds. Social shunning in a space built on community could be a powerful deterrent. It was like getting blocked online, but in real life, and with fewer cat videos to distract you from the isolation. Then there were the punishments specifically tied to the feared political talk. If an informant reported you for seditious conversation, the consequences could be severe and swift. Arrest, interrogation, which often involved torture, imprisonment, or even execution were all possibilities, depending on the perceived severity of your words and the political climate. Simply grumbling about taxes might get you a beating, but questioning the Sultan's legitimacy could cost you your head. This is where the risk of the coffee house became truly apparent. The casual exchange of opinions could literally be deadly. A mainstream historical fact is that Sultan Murad IV, reigned 1623 to 1640, is widely cited in historical sources for enacting particularly brutal measures against coffee houses, including the threat of execution for those found operating or frequenting them, though the consistent application of this extreme penalty is debated among historians. Some punishments were perhaps more theatrical, or designed for public humiliation rather than just physical pain. There are accounts, possibly embellished over time, of coffee house owners or patrons being paraded through the streets as a warning to others, sometimes with coffee pots or cups hung around their necks. Imagine being forced to walk through the bazaar, your shame broadcast by the very symbols of your crime. It's a bizarre form of public shaming, turning the beloved object of desire into a mark of disgrace. Look, everyone! This person liked coffee too much! A quirky or fringe tidbit related to the punishments is the story, often attributed to Murad IV's era, of the Sultan himself sometimes going out in disguise to catch coffee house patrons or owners red-handed. According to these tales, if he found someone violating the ban, the punishment could be meted out on the spot, including beheading. While likely exaggerated for dramatic effect, these stories circulated and added to the fear and legend surrounding his rule and the dangers of the coffee house. Imagine your city's mayor showing up in a fake mustache to catch you violating zoning laws, and the penalty is, well, significantly worse than a fine. Historians still argue whether the severity of the punishments, particularly the death penalty under Murad IV, was primarily a genuine reflection of the state's fear of coffee houses as revolutionary centers, or if it was part of a broader strategy of projecting an image of absolute control and ruthlessness during a period of political instability, with the actual enforcement being less widespread than the rhetoric suggested. Were the punishments truly as common and extreme as some accounts claim, or were they more symbolic threats designed to intimidate? The constant threat of these varied punishments, from social exclusion to state execution, shaped the culture of the coffee house. It encouraged caution, self-censorship, and the development of those unwritten rules we discussed. It made the simple act of gathering for coffee a low-level act of defiance, or at least a calculated risk. You learned to read the room, to trust cautiously, and to know when to hold your tongue. So, you're sitting there, maybe hearing a hushed story about someone who was recently arrested after being seen too often in a certain coffee house, or perhaps witnessing a patron get the cold shoulder for being disruptive. You feel the weight of the potential consequences. The peculiar charm of the Ottoman coffee house, with its vibrant culture and stimulating brew, was always balanced by this underlying tension, the knowledge that breaking the rules, whether formal or informal, could lead to unpleasant, sometimes even bizarre, repercussions. It was a high-stakes game played over small cups of dark liquid. So, you've felt the chill of potential punishment, right? That understanding that even a casual chat over coffee could lead to anything from a social snub to a date with the executioner, depending on the era and the topic. The threat was always there, a dark shadow cast by the state's deep-seated suspicion of these popular gathering places. And sometimes, that shadow lengthened and became a full-blown storm, leading to large-scale, dramatic crackdowns and famous closures that echoed through the history of the Ottoman coffee house. These weren't just isolated incidents where a single unruly coffee house was shut down. We're talking about periods where the authorities, often spurred by renewed fears of sedition or the influence of particularly strict religious figures, decided to take widespread action. Imagine waking up one morning to find that all the coffee houses in your neighborhood, or even across the entire city, were being forcibly closed. The places where you spent your leisure time, conducted informal business, heard the news, and connected with your community, suddenly boarded up, perhaps with stern-faced janissaries standing guard. One of the most infamous periods of crackdown occurred during the reign of Sultan Murad IV in the early to mid-17th century. Remember him? The one who made operating or frequenting a coffee house potentially punishable by death? His rule was marked by a particularly severe approach to anything he perceived as undermining public order or his authority, and coffee houses were high on that list, alongside tobacco and alcohol. Driven by a blend of religious conviction, some accounts say he was influenced by hardline ulama, and a ruthless desire for control. Murad IV launched widespread campaigns to suppress these establishments. During these crackdowns, large numbers of coffee houses would be raided simultaneously. Owners were arrested, patrons were rounded up, and the buildings were often dismantled or destroyed. Imagine the scene. The air, usually thick with the aroma of roasting beans and the murmur of voices, is suddenly filled with the sounds of splintering wood, shouting guards, and hurried footsteps as people try to escape. It was a brutal, efficient way to send a message and disrupt the social fabric that had become so intertwined with coffee culture. These closures weren't just an inconvenience, they were a major disruption to urban life. Where would people gather now? How would news spread? Where would the storytellers perform? The sudden absence of these vital social hubs left a void, impacting everything from informal commerce and networking among guilds to the simple pleasure of shared leisure. It was like deleting all social media and shutting down every cafe and pub in your city simultaneously. Chaos, right? A mainstream historical fact is that Sultan Murad IV is historically documented as implementing severe bans on coffee houses and ordering widespread closures during his reign, 1623 to 1640, often with harsh penalties, making this period one of the most notable crackdowns on coffee culture in Ottoman history. Despite the severity, these crackdowns often proved difficult to sustain in the long run. The demand for coffee and the social spaces it provided was simply too high. As soon as the immediate pressure from the authorities subsided, coffee houses would begin to reappear, sometimes in the same locations, sometimes in more discreet spots. Owners and patrons became adept at weathering these storms, lying low until the danger passed, and then cautiously reopening. The resilience of the coffee house culture in the face of such brutal opposition is a testament to its deep roots in Ottoman society. Another significant crackdown, though perhaps less severe than Murad IV's era, occurred during periods of political instability or after failed uprisings, when the state's paranoia about sedition was particularly high. Any place where men gathered and talked freely became a suspect location, and coffee houses, being the most prominent of these, were often the first targets. Even if a specific coffee house wasn't directly involved in plotting, its mere existence as a space for uncontrolled assembly made it vulnerable during times of heightened state anxiety. It was guilt by association, the association being, people talk here, and talking might lead to trouble. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to these crackdowns is the occasional focus on specific types of coffee houses. While general bans were common, There were instances where crackdowns seemed particularly aimed at haunts known to be frequented by potentially troublesome groups, like janissaries. Raids might be concentrated on these specific locations, highlighting the state's targeted approach when they suspected particular groups were using the coffee house for organizing or expressing dissent. Imagine the authorities having a list. Okay, raid the merchant ones tomorrow, but the janissary places get hit tonight. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation behind these large-scale crackdowns was a genuine fear of political conspiracy originating in coffee houses, or if they were more symbolic acts intended to demonstrate the Sultan's power and reinforce state control over public life during challenging times. Were they truly dismantling seditious networks, or just publicly punishing popular pastimes to show who was boss? The memory of these famous closures and crackdowns became part of the coffee house lore. Patrons and owners would tell stories, perhaps exaggerated over time, of the dangers they faced, the narrow escapes, and the resilience of their community. These narratives added a layer of defiance and shared experience to the simple act of drinking coffee. Every cup shared after a crackdown was, in a way, a small victory against the forces that sought to suppress them. These periods of intense pressure highlight the peculiar tightrope walk of the Ottoman coffee house. It was a place of vibrant social life, cultural exchange, and necessary leisure, but it was also constantly under threat, a battleground between popular culture and state control. The dramatic closures were stark reminders that the freedom enjoyed within those walls was conditional, always subject to the whims and fears of the ruling power. But just as the bans failed, these crackdowns, while devastating in the moment, ultimately couldn't extinguish the fire that coffee houses had lit in Ottoman society. They might close them down, but they couldn't erase the desire for the drink or the need for the space. And eventually, this constant battle would lead to a slow, gradual shift in the official status of the coffee house. You've survived the crackdowns, ducked the janissaries, and perhaps even witnessed a coffee house being boarded up, only to see it quietly reopen a few months later, like a particularly stubborn phoenix rising from the ashes, or maybe just the discarded coffee grounds. You've seen the state try its best to ban, regulate, and spy on these places, but the peculiar truth is, they never truly managed to stamp them out. The resilience of the coffee house culture, fueled by public demand, economic interest, and sheer cultural inertia, meant that the constant battle between the authorities and the coffee houses couldn't last forever in its initial, brutal form. Over centuries, the status of the coffee house in the Ottoman Empire underwent a slow, fascinating transformation, moving from being a feared, forbidden den of sedition to a widely accepted, even cherished, institution. This wasn't a sudden shift, mind you. It was a gradual evolution, a slow dance of negotiation between state power and popular will. The sultans and the ulama didn't suddenly wake up one morning and say, "You know what? Coffee houses are great." Far from it. Suspicion and attempts at control continued for a long time. But the outright, death penalty level bans became less frequent and less sustainable over the late 17th and 18th centuries. Why? Because the state eventually had to confront the reality that prohibition wasn't working, and trying to enforce it was costly, difficult, and often counterproductive, breeding resentment without achieving its goals. Think of it like trying to ban loud music at parties. You might issue decrees, raid a few houses, but if everyone loves dancing and has drums, they're just going to move the party somewhere else, maybe underground, where you really can't see what they're doing. The Ottoman state eventually realized that it was better to have these social gatherings in visible, semi-controllable spaces like coffee houses, even with their risks, than to drive them into genuinely secret locations where plotting could occur without any oversight whatsoever. A coffee house, even a potentially problematic one, was still easier to monitor than a hidden cellar or a private home gathering. The economic argument also became increasingly difficult to ignore. Coffee trading grew into a massive, profitable business, generating significant tax revenue for the state. Coffee houses themselves employed thousands of people, owners, coffee makers, ****, storytellers, musicians, gamekeepers, servers. They purchased large quantities of coffee, sugar, and other supplies. Shutting them down meant disrupting a significant part of the urban economy, and cutting off a valuable source of income for both individuals and the treasury. It's hard to maintain a moral panic about idleness when the thing you're panicking about is making a lot of people, including potentially people connected to the state, quite wealthy. Money, as they say, talks, sometimes louder than religious condemnations or fears of sedition. As coffee became more commonplace, its novelty wore off, and the initial, almost superstitious fears about its nature, remember the touch-by-fire theory, began to fade, at least among the general populace and more pragmatic members of the ulama. While some conservative scholars might still grumble, the dominant religious opinion gradually shifted towards acceptance, finding interpretations that deemed coffee permissible. It was no longer seen as a dangerous, intoxicating foreign substance, but simply as a popular beverage. Like how kale went from a weird garnish to something everyone eats. The social function of the coffee house also became undeniable. They were integral to urban life, serving as informal post offices, job centers, news hubs, and community centers. They provided a space for men to socialize, network, and relax in a society with limited public leisure options. Trying to eliminate them was trying to eliminate a vital social organ. The state could regulate them, tax them, and monitor them, but they couldn't realistically eradicate the need they fulfilled. A mainstream historical fact is that by the 18th century, coffee houses were largely accepted as legitimate businesses and social institutions within the Ottoman Empire, regulated and taxed by the state rather than routinely banned. While surveillance and occasional crackdowns still occurred, the era of widespread prohibition and severe, life-threatening penalties for simple patronage had largely passed. This shift in status meant that the peculiar rules of the coffee house also changed. The intense paranoia about every conversation lessened somewhat, though surveillance never disappeared entirely. The unwritten rules of etiquette remained important for social harmony, but perhaps without the same life-or-death urgency that came with the constant threat of denunciation. The formal regulations shifted from outright bans to rules about licensing, taxation, closing hours, though these were still often ignored, and maintaining public order. The relationship became less about suppression and more about management and exploitation. How can the state control this space and also profit from it? Coffee houses even began to appear within the palace grounds or near official buildings, catering to state officials and courtiers. The very people who had once feared and banned them were now frequenting them. It was the ultimate sign of acceptance, like your parents finally liking the band you were obsessed with in high school, years after they grounded you for listening to it too loud. A quirky or fringe tidbit illustrating this acceptance is the development of highly specialized, even luxurious, coffee houses catering to the elite in later centuries. These establishments, far from the humble, suspicious dens of the 16th century, were decorated lavishly, offered high-quality coffee, and attracted wealthy patrons and intellectuals. Their existence openly contradicted the earlier image of coffee houses as places solely for idleness and lower-class sedition, showcasing their evolution into sophisticated social venues. Imagine a coffee house with velvet cushions and miniature indoor fountains, a far cry from sitting on a mat hoping not to get arrested. Historians still argue whether the eventual acceptance of coffee houses was primarily a pragmatic decision by the state driven by economic realities and the failure of prohibition, or if it also reflected a genuine cultural shift and a growing recognition of the positive social roles these institutions played, despite the lingering risks. Was it purely about control and money, or did the authorities genuinely come to appreciate the value of these spaces? By the time the Ottoman Empire entered its later centuries, the coffee house was an undeniable fixture of urban life, a symbol of Ottoman culture that would eventually spread its influence across the world. The peculiar rules that governed these spaces, born out of the tension between novelty, fear, piety, politics, and popular demand, had evolved alongside their status. You could now generally enjoy your coffee and conversation without the immediate, visceral fear of a janissary raid or a death sentence, though a healthy dose of caution about what you said never entirely went out of style. The journey of the Ottoman coffee house, from a suspected foreign import to a central social institution, is a testament to the power of cultural adaptation and the enduring human need for connection, conversation, and a really good cup of coffee. The peculiar rules weren't just arbitrary restrictions. They were the living, breathing outcome of centuries of push and pull, a reflection of the complex social and political landscape in which coffee brewed its way into the heart of the empire. You've seen how it arrived, how it caused panic, how it was fought over, and how it eventually found its place. Now, let's see how that legacy continues to shape the world, even today. So, you've journeyed through the peculiar world of the Ottoman coffee house, from its cautious arrival and the first tentative sips, through the battles with the state and religious authorities, the harsh crackdowns and surprising resilience, the complex layers of formal and informal rules, the vibrant entertainment, and the constant shadow of surveillance. You've seen how a simple drink, brewed from exotic beans, transformed urban life, created new social spaces, and became a peculiar battleground for power, piety, and popular culture. But the story doesn't end there, tucked away in the history books of a vanished empire. The legacy of those early Ottoman coffee houses reaches out across the centuries, shaping the way we consume coffee and interact in public spaces even today, in ways you might not even realize. Think about it. What is a modern cafe? It's a place outside the home and work, where people gather to drink a stimulating beverage, chat, read, work, or simply observe the world go by. Sound familiar? That fundamental concept, the public, secular space centered around a non-alcoholic drink that encourages lingering and conversation, was pioneered by the Ottomans. Before the coffee house, such spaces were rare. Taverns existed, yes, but they had a different clientele and purpose. The Ottoman coffee house created the blueprint for the modern cafe as a social and cultural hub. The idea of going out for coffee as a social activity, a reason to meet and talk, started here. The very ritual of coffee preparation and serving that developed in the Ottoman Empire influenced coffee cultures around the world. The finely ground beans, the boiling in a small pot, the sezvoribrik, the serving in small cups, *finkens*, this method, often referred to today as Turkish coffee, spread across the Middle East, North Africa, the Balkans, and even into parts of Europe. While brewing methods have diversified globally, espresso, filter, etc., the core tradition of boiling finely ground coffee with water is a direct descendant of the technique perfected in those early Ottoman establishments. When you order a strong, dark coffee served in a small cup, you're participating in a ritual that is centuries old and has its roots firmly planted in Ottoman soil. The coffee house as a center for information and ideas also left a lasting mark. While today we have the internet, newspapers, and television, the historical role of coffee houses as places where news spread, debates happened, and public opinion formed was crucial. This function was later replicated in coffee houses in Europe, becoming centers for intellectual discussion, political debate, and the dissemination of pamphlets and early newspapers during the Enlightenment and beyond. The Parisian cafes of the French Revolution or the London coffee houses that gave birth to institutions like Lloyd's of London, which started as a coffee house for ship owners and merchants to exchange information, are direct descendants of their Ottoman predecessors. The idea of a public space for caffeinated conversation and information exchange traveled west, evolving but retaining that core function. A mainstream historical fact is that the Ottoman coffee house is widely recognized by historians as the direct ancestor of the European coffee house, which in turn played a crucial role in the development of public spheres, intellectual discourse, and financial institutions in Europe, demonstrating a clear lineage from the Ottoman model to global cafe culture. The entertainment aspect also persists, albeit in different forms. While meta storytellers and Karagaz shadow plays might not be standard fare in your local cafe, the concept of a coffee house as a place for performance, whether it's live music, poetry readings, open mic nights, or even just screens showing news or entertainment, continues that Ottoman tradition of combining beverage consumption with cultural engagement. Your favorite cafe with live acoustic music? It owes a little something to those smoky rooms where poets recited their verses and storytellers spun their yarns. Even the peculiar tension between the coffee house as a space of freedom and its potential for surveillance resonates today. While the methods are different, less likely to be a spy in a turban, more likely digital surveillance, the concern about public gathering spaces as potential sites for dissent or organization remains relevant in various contexts globally. The Ottoman state's struggle to control conversation in coffee houses is an early example of a challenge many authorities still face: how to manage public discourse in spaces outside direct state control. A quirky or fringe tidbit about the modern legacy is how the term mocha might have Ottoman roots. While the drink today usually refers to coffee with chocolate, the original mocha coffee was named after the port of Mocha in Yemen, from where the Ottomans initially imported their beans. So, when you order a mocha, you're indirectly referencing the very trade route that brought coffee to Istanbul and kicked off this whole peculiar history. Your fancy chocolate latte is a nod to 16th century Yemeni beans and Ottoman traders. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman influence on global coffee culture is primarily limited to the concept of the coffee house as a social space and the brewing method, or if it also encompasses deeper, less tangible aspects like the specific etiquette of lingering, the emphasis on conversation, and the blend of leisure and information exchange. Was it just the physical blueprint and the recipe that spread, or did the Ottoman adab al-Qawa subtly influence how people behave in cafes everywhere? The resilience of the coffee house, its ability to survive centuries of opposition and adapt to changing times, speaks to the enduring human need for connection. In a world that can often feel isolating, the simple act of sharing a space, a drink, and a moment of conversation with others remains a powerful draw. The Ottoman coffee house, born of peculiar circumstances and governed by peculiar rules, tapped into something fundamental about social interaction, creating a model that has stood the test of time and spread its aroma across the globe. So, the next time you find yourself in a cafe, anywhere in the world, take a moment. Feel the warmth of the cup in your hands, inhale the rich aroma, listen to the low murmur of voices around you. You're not just in a modern cafe, you're standing on the shoulders of centuries of history, in a space whose very existence owes a debt to those pioneering, controversial, and peculiar coffee houses of the Ottoman Empire. You're part of a legacy that began with a cautious sip in 16th century Istanbul, a legacy of conversation, connection, and caffeine that continues to brew on, long after the sultans and their spies have faded into the quiet pages of history. As the light begins to fade outside, and the sounds of the day soften, perhaps you can feel that gentle hum settling in, the one that reminds you it's time to wind down. The journey through the peculiar rules of the Ottoman coffee house is complete. You've navigated the spies, the sultans, the storytellers, and the subtle etiquette. Your mind is perhaps buzzing just a little from all the history, and the lingering scent of imaginary coffee. Let that buzz gently fade, like the last embers of a brazier in a quiet coffee house. The debates are over for tonight, the stories are told, the cups are empty. The air is still and calm. There's nothing left to fear, no rules to break, just the quiet comfort of knowing you've explored a fascinating corner of the past. Let your breath slow, feel the weight of your body, settling down, deeper and deeper, into softness. The peculiar world is fading now, leaving only peace and quiet. Sleep well.